A leather corner pushed out from under a scatter of gray rock the way a bookmark peeks from a Bible that's been shut too quickly. The cover was sun-bleached and water-dimpled, but when I picked it up, the spine held, and the air in that canyon went still. I didn't have to open it to know whose handwriting waited inside. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Before that day, life in our corner of the Central Valley moved like the river in late summer, steady, predictable, and honest about where it was headed. I worked the early shift at Millerton Lake 4 days a week, then a 10-hour Saturday whenever fishing traffic picked up. Mornings smelled of wet rope and sunblock. Canada geese stitched low across the waterline as I checked docks and hull numbers. My radio clipped to the shoulder strap of a pack that carried the same gear every time: map book trauma kit, laminated citation sheets, and a yellow notepad worn thin at the edges. Carlos kept the radio one channel over a habit he joked about, but never changed. You monitor rescues. I monitor teenagers, he liked to say, tapping the weathered mic with a knuckle. He was the best ranger I've known. Methodical without being stiff, tender with the public without losing the edge you need in this work. He kept a folded trail map tucked in his chest pocket, the way other men carry a photograph. His girls colored his world. If a day was carved out for them, everything else moved around it. Most Fridays, after we cleared the boat ramp and checked the lifeguard stands, I'd drive the county road into town for coffee with Isabel. We met in the back corner of the teacher lounge at Roosevelt High, where she graded lab reports under a corkboard that held a cutout monarch butterfly and a paper skeleton wearing a stethoscope. Isabel favored real talk and strong coffee, which is why we got along. She'd update me on whichever seniors were trying to convince her a frog dissection counted as extra credit, and I'd promise again to come speak to her class about trail ethics and the realities of SAR. The Martinez front yard smelled of citrus when the wind blew west. Evenings there often meant Carlos standing under the porch light with a garden hose in one hand and a rake leaning against his leg, water pooling at the base of a lemon tree, his radio turned down low. From the sidewalk I'd hear Sophia before I saw her, that quick, heel-toe crunch of a teenager who has somewhere to be. She was small in the way a coiled spring is small, energy packed tight. When she spotted me, she'd tug on the brim of my uniform cap like it was a bell pull and ask what time we were running the junior hikes next month. She loved anything that involved a topo map, a whistle, and a reason to be first up the hill. Elena moved slower. She had a leather sketchbook she carried the way other kids carry a phone, the surface nicked by 1,000 small journeys. She'd sit cross-legged on the curb with her back against their mailbox, drawing the way afternoon light broke across a neighbor's pickup or the curled husk of a sunflower in the side yard. When she looked up, there was always a tiny pause, as if the world needed a second to catch up to whatever she'd seen. My wife Nora ran a Saturday art co-op at the community center. Elena favored ink and soft pencil. She drew what she noticed before she drew what she knew. The Tuesday before that October weekend, I met Carlos in the equipment shed and helped him pull a pair of old trekking poles from a locker that never quite closed flush. He was coiling extra line, the rough nylon biting into calluses already layered from a lifetime of field work. "Upper Pines is booked," he said, not looking up. "We got the site by the loop with the bear boxes under those tall pines. We'll be out before the crowds hit the steps." The steps meant the stone staircase the park carved beside the waterfall, the one serious hikers swear by and casual hikers swear at. The mist trail isn't Everest, but it asks for your attention and punishes any wander in the mind. I've walked it in 3 different decades. It doesn't change much except in how honest it teaches you to be with your lungs. "Forecast?" I asked. "Clear," he said. And then, because he was Carlos, "But the Sierra is like a neighbor who smiles while she changes the locks, pleasant until she isn't." He pinched the forecast printout between 2 fingers. Highs in the low 60s, nights cold enough to show breath. Wind variable. Chance of afternoon buildups in the high country, which in our work is less a prediction than a reminder to keep your eyes up. Isabel came by the station after last bell on Thursday, a cloth grocery bag over one shoulder and a stack of field guides under the other. "If your junior hikers need extra compasses," she said to me. I cleaned out the lab cabinet. She set them on my desk with a care that belonged to living things, then rummaged in the bag and produced a battered mug. The print on the side was cracked from 100 rinses. "Plant cells are my jam." She left it there with a smile and said nothing about the way my own mug had gone missing 2 weeks before. Isabel was that sort. She made order feel like kindness. The night before they left, I walked over to their place with a spare fuel canister and a fresh pair of bootlaces. The porch light threw a neat circle on the concrete. Through the open window, I could hear the low, companionable clatter of a family that understood ritual pots drying on a towel, the zip of a tent bag, the short laugh that comes when someone misplaces a headlamp and then finds it on their own forehead. The air carried orange blossom and the faint bite of rubbing alcohol from a first aid kit getting its seasonal audit. Their old pickup, a dull red half-ton with a bench seat that had seen better cloth, sat nose out in the driveway. Carlos always pulled it that way the night before any trip habit meant for faster exits that had nothing to do with emergency and everything to do with the pleasure of leaving at dawn. Sophia met me at the door with a roll of duct tape like a sheriff's badge. "We're going early," she said. "Dad says if we beat the buses, I get the first photo from the bridge." "Save your legs on the first mile," I told her, which is something old rangers say when they don't want to admit how long it's been since they ran stairs with any pride. She rocked heel to toe, and nodded like a promise. Elena sat at the kitchen table with a camera battery in her palm and that leather sketchbook open to a page where a pressed wildflower hid in the gutter. She wore a canvas jacket 2 sizes bigger than she needed, sleeves rolled cuffs darkened by graphite. I watched her lift the flower by its stem paws and lower it back into place with a gentleness that made me lower my voice without thinking. "You bringing that up there?" I asked. She closed the cover with the edge of her palm. "It goes where I go," she said. Then a small smile as if she'd caught herself sounding dramatic and wanted to soften it. "It's lighter than it looks." Carlos walked me out to the porch. We stood in that easy quiet that comes when men who've worked together longer than they can explain run through a checklist without speaking. He looked down the street the way he always did at the end of a long day, hands on hips, shoulders set as if measuring what his work had changed and what it had no power over. The sky over Fresno held a thin, clean blue faint wisps like chalk on slate. "You want me to swing a dinner by Sunday?" I asked. It was our standing trade one family cooked for the other after any big weekend out. "Let me see how the girls feel," he said. "If they hit the top and back like they want, they'll nap through anything you carry over." We laughed quietly at that 2 men in middle age who'd both learned how naps slip through the fingers of the young. As I stepped down the porch, Isabel clicked the front light on, then off, then on again, 3 quick taps. Not for me. For the girls. A family code. 3 meant, "We're all set. Sleep fast. We leave at first light." Friday came warm and glassy. By 9, I stood on the west dock at Millerton and waved a pair of kayakers into the shade. A striped bass rolled in the channel. Jet skis stitched white slashes through the no-wake like the rules were a suggestion. I wrote 2 warnings for life jackets that weren't on bodies and a citation for glass bottles out on the island. Routine held. That afternoon, Nora and I drove east on Friant Road with the windows down and the radio low. She pointed to a cloud bank over the Sierra, clean-lined tall, throwing a long shadow even this far out. "Pretty," she said. I told her the only true thing you can say about mountains from the valley floor. Everything pretty up there comes with a price. She squeezed my hand, not because she agreed, but because she knew that sentence lives in the bones of men who've carried stretchers uphill. Saturday before sunrise, the Martinez porch light snapped on at 5:02 a.m. The old pickup coughed once and then settled into the friendly rumble of a machine that had learned its family. I heard it through our open bedroom window, a familiar comfort stitched into the fabric of the block. A door thumped shut. A latch clacked. Somebody laughed softly, the sound of a mother counting heads without counting and getting the number right. Their taillights slid away. Our street returned to darkened sprinklers. By mid-morning, the sun over the lake had the white bite of October. I checked radio weather fare. I leaned back in the office chair and filled out a maintenance request for the cracked hinge on the north gate, adding the same note I'd added last time. "Please grease," Squeal spooks the kids during campfire talks. Isabel sent Nora a photo of a thermos and a handwritten note, vernal first, then see how they feel. The handwriting was tidy, the kind you remember from teachers who kept rulers in the top drawer and forgiveness in the bottom. Nora smiled at the picture and set her phone face down, a small ritual in our house that means we're staying present. Around noon, the wind shifted. Nothing dramatic, just a gentle lean from the west that brought a lake smell of sun-warmed algae and the faint, metallic tang of wet granite 100 miles away. I cracked the office window and let it in. My radio hissed a few brief updates that didn't touch my jurisdiction. A loose dog on a campground loop, a sedan with a dead battery at a trailhead, a reminder about a school group due at 11 that came at 12. I thought of Sophia convincing her family up one more step to a better view. I thought of Elena finding an angle nobody else would notice. Late afternoon is when the valley sighs. Heat lifts. The light goes long and kind. I finished paperwork and checked my phone out of habit. Carlos and I had a running exchange on big days. He'd send a picture of water shearing off granite. I'd send a picture of a kid learning to tie a bowline. That string of photos made a private scrapbook of two men who loved the same work from different angles. Nothing buzzed, no tone, just the wash of an empty screen and the soft hum of the office fan. At 6, Nora set out plates on the patio and clicked our porch light on. Out back, the neighbors' wind chimes gave a lazy jingle. I poured sweet tea over ice and watched shadows collect in the yard. Somewhere on the block, a game came on the radio, AM low, a hometown announcer worn smooth by years. I thought about sending a check-in text and didn't. When families are doing what they love, the last thing they need is your voice stepping on the moment. At 8, I took the trash to the curb and stood there longer than the chore required. The air had cooled into the low 50s. My breath showed in the cone of the street lamp. A moth tapped the glass, then disappeared into the dark. Down the street, the Martinez porch light clicked on 1 press not 3 and stayed there steady and unblinking, as if holding its place against the night. Inside our kitchen, the clock over the sink slid past 8:30. My phone lay face up on the counter silent, except for the glow that comes when it thinks it hears a voice and finds only the refrigerator's whisper. I told myself they were tired, that the road home would keep until morning, that quiet was part of any good day in the mountains. Still, when I turned off our living room lamp, I left the porch light burning a little longer than usual. Not because anyone needed it to find our door, but because on streets like ours a light left on means we're awake, and sometimes that's enough to bring the night a little closer to morning. By Sunday morning, the street outside my house was still wet from sprinklers, and the porch lights that usually went out by dawn were all dark except mine. I remember standing there, coffee cooling in my hand, looking toward the Martinez place. Their truck wasn't back yet, but that wasn't unusual. Yosemite weekends always stretched long, especially for Carlos. He liked to linger on the last morning walk, a quieter trail, maybe find a spot where the girls could rest before the long drive home. Still, there was something about the silence that sat wrong. The kind of silence that doesn't just hang in the air, it listens. I went about the morning routine anyway. Filed reports, checked in with my deputy on a minor boating incident, answered a call from the volunteer unit about a missing tackle box near the North Dock. But through all of it, that quiet tugged at me. Around noon, the heat built fast. It was one of those Fresno afternoons where the air feels thick enough to bend light and the hills shimmer in a way that tricks your eyes. I was logging the day's water levels when my radio cracked alive with a tone that froze me mid-sentence. A unit calling in from Yosemite dispatch cross-patched it through my line because it came from a ranger I knew. "Pat, this is Sarah Chen up in the valley," she said, her voice steady but thin. "I've got an active missing persons report at Vernal Fall. Names are Elena and Sofia Martinez." For a second I couldn't breathe. I asked her to repeat it, hoping I'd misheard. She didn't. 2 teenage sisters, she went on, parents on site. Father's a ranger, works your district. I could hear radio chatter behind her wind helicopter prep someone calling coordinates. My hand shook enough that I had to set the mic down on the desk. By the time I reached Yosemite, the light had that late-day gold that photographers chase but rangers dread. It meant the search would soon be working against the clock. The valley was crowded cars lined shoulder to shoulder, people moving slow, unaware that a crisis was unfolding a few miles up trail. When I got to the mist trail entrance, the air was heavy with spray from the waterfall miles ahead, and the sound of the river drowned out the smaller things' boots on gravel voices trying to stay calm. Isabel was standing near the trailhead, her face drained, eyes locked on the switchbacks where the crowd of searchers had started their climb. Her clothes were still damp from mist, or maybe from tears. I couldn't tell which. Carlos was further up the path, talking to Sarah near a granite boulder marked with temporary tape. I'd worked beside this man for years, seen him navigate flash floods, cliff rescues, wildfires. But that afternoon, I saw something I'd never seen in him before. Helplessness. The kind that strips a man down to the simplest thought, find them. They briefed me as we moved. The girls had been seen near the overlook around noon just after lunch. A few hikers remembered them, the older one with a camera, the younger one with a red backpack. Then nothing. 1 minute they were in sight, the next gone. The family from Oregon who'd spoken to Isabel confirmed the direction they'd gone, but no one saw them return. At first everyone assumed they'd taken a short detour for photos. That's what hikers do, chase a better view. But when minutes stretched to an hour, then 2 panics started to set in. Carlos had sprinted down the trail for help, nearly twisted an ankle doing it. By the time the first ranger team arrived, clouds were building over the ridge and the granite had gone slick with moisture. That trail eats time even in good weather. Searching it in fog is like trying to find footprints on a mirror. I joined the second team, pushing toward the top of Vernal Fall. The sound was deafening, the mist a constant curtain. We moved in careful formation, checking every flat of rock, every patch of soft soil that might hold a boot mark. The river boiled over the lip of the cliff, a white roar that vibrated in the chest. I knelt to examine a faint scuff near a pool, but it could have been from any hiker. Granite doesn't keep memories, it sheds them. From above, the helicopter began slow circles, the thrum of its blades swallowed by the waterfall's voice. Isabel stood with binoculars, scanning the rim again and again as if sheer will might force her daughters into view. Night fell before we made it back down. Floodlights and portable lamps carved thin corridors of light through the mist. Volunteers, climbers, off-duty rangers, even visitors joined the search line. I saw the look in their eyes, people who'd come to Yosemite for beauty and found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder in tragedy. Around midnight, I checked in with the incident command post. Nothing. No signal hits, no personal items, no sound picked up by thermal or acoustic sensors. The dogs found a few scents near the trail's midpoint, but they vanished in the spray zone where water masked everything. When I finally sat down on a rock to rest, I looked at Carlos across the way. He was still pacing, flashlight beam cutting arcs through the dark. Isabel hadn't sat once since I'd arrived. Every few minutes she'd call a name into the canyon, her voice small against the roar, and then wait like maybe an echo could answer back. The second day came with clear skies, but a dull ache that told us the first window had closed. Fresh crews rotated in. Drones took flight over the cliffs. Technical climbers prepared to rappel below the falls into the spray zone where debris collects. I joined the logistics team mapping coordinates on a digital overlay squares and circles over satellite images that didn't care about heartbreak. Mid-morning, a climber radioed that he'd found fabric caught on brush about 300 feet below the overlook. We froze. Everyone held their breath. When he reached it, he called again, "Tourist scarf. Pink. Faded. Tag says, made in Taiwan. Not theirs." The collective exhale was quiet, but it was the sound of hope cracking just a little more. The hours blended after that. You stop feeling time in a search like this, you just chase daylight. By the third day, we'd covered more than 5 miles in every direction. The teams worked in grids, careful not to contaminate what might later become evidence. Helicopters swept from dawn to dusk. Isabel tried to keep notes on a small pad the way Elena used to with her journal. Her handwriting grew smaller as the days went on. Carlos barely slept, spending nights by the command tent staring at topographic maps illuminated by his headlamp. I brought him coffee once. He didn't drink it. He asked me quietly if I believed in intuition. I said I did. Then, tell me, he said, if you feel they're still alive. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. By the end of the second week, the operation had the weight of inevitability. The press trucks lined the park road. Reporters set up near the visitor center, their voices soft, but their cameras relentless. The word closure began slipping into briefings, a word nobody wanted to hear. When Superintendent Williams finally sat the family down to explain that the search was moving from active to suspended, the air in that room turned solid. Isabel stared at the maps, each colored line representing hundreds of hours of human effort that hadn't been enough. Carlos nodded once, like a soldier acknowledging orders he didn't believe in. I stood by the doorway, useless. I'd seen death before recoveries after flash floods, bodies brought out of ravines, but nothing prepared me for watching hope end in a conference room under fluorescent light. Back home in Fresno, the neighborhood felt wrong. You could feel the absence from the street. Their mailbox filled with sympathy cards, and someone left wildflowers on the porch rail every morning for weeks. I helped Carlos unload the equipment when he finally drove back. The tent was still damp, folded wrong. He lifted it out of the truck bed, stared at it for a long time, and said, "Smells like rain." Then he walked inside. Isabel quit teaching by winter. She told me her mind couldn't hold other people's children just yet. Carlos kept his post, though they pulled him off field work for a while. I think the brass thought they were helping, but it only deepened the wound. He spent long hours in the office revisiting maps, cross-referencing wilderness reports, chasing any new disappearance across the state like maybe it could lead back to his girls. Years slid by in that uneasy rhythm. The case grew colder, but never cold enough to forget. Hikers would still mention it to rangers on the trail, the sisters who vanished without a sound. Some swore they'd seen something, a flash of color in the trees, a faint cry carried on wind. Every tip got logged. Every lead went nowhere. Isabel started attending conferences for families of the missing. She once told me over coffee, "I can't fix what happened, but I can make sure people don't stop asking questions." She kept a binder of every theory anyone ever sent her, labeled and cross-checked. Carlos built a small wooden box for keepsakes, postcards, photos, a keychain Sophia had won at a science fair. They were doing what all survivors do, holding the world steady with both hands while the ground keeps shifting beneath them. I visited Yosemite every October after that. It became a ritual. I'd hike the mist trail stop by the bridge below Vernal Fall and stand there long enough for my clothes to take on the same damp chill they must have felt that day. Sometimes I'd see families posing for photos, kids laughing, parents calling them back from the edge. I never told them I was looking for ghosts. The sound of that waterfall still drowns everything else, the voices, the questions, even the guilt, but it never drowns the memory. 7 years after they vanished, I was sitting in the station sorting through seasonal reports when a call came through from a ranger out of the valley. The line was faint, crackling through static, but I caught one phrase clear as a bell. Journal recovered name inside reads Elena Martinez. For a long time I couldn't speak. The voice on the other end repeated the coordinates slower this time, as if coaxing me back into the moment. A pair of college campers had found it under loose granite in Tenaya Canyon, miles from where anyone had searched. The ranger said it looked weathered but intact. My first thought was of that old leather cover I'd seen so many times in their kitchen, the one she'd guarded like it was alive. That night I didn't sleep. I kept picturing a canyon none of us had touched, a place that had waited 7 years to speak. Every ranger knows the land has its own way of telling stories, some loud, some whispered through stone and time. As I watched the first light creep over the valley the next morning, I knew we were about to hear Elena's voice again. Only this time it wouldn't be a memory. It would be a truth rising out of the ground, one line at a time. The call came early, before the sun had lifted the fog off the valley. I was sitting at my desk in the ranger station, half reading an equipment report, when my phone buzzed against the wood. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was Yosemite. When I answered, a woman's voice, young, steady, but nervous, introduced herself as Ranger Kim Alvarez from the Backcountry Division. "Sir," she said, "you were listed as a contact for the Martinez case. We recovered something up in Tenaya Canyon. It looks like a journal." I remember the way she said journal, soft, almost reverent, like the word itself carried weight. For a few seconds, I didn't move. Then she added, "It's intact enough to read, sir. The name inside is Elena. I left for Yosemite that afternoon. The drive felt longer than it had any right to be. I'd taken that same stretch of highway 100 times in my life, but that day it looked different, flatter, grayer every turn, slower than the last. By the time I reached the valley floor, the light had gone gold and thin, the way it gets before dusk when everything feels too still. The ranger outpost near Tenaya Canyon buzzed with quiet urgency, trail dust boots thudding on wood floors, radios crackling, short bursts of coded chatter. I met Ranger Alvarez near the evidence table. She handed me a clear bag containing a leather-bound book, its corners frayed cover, water darkened but holding shape. It was wedged beneath some rockfall, she said. 2 campers found it while setting up their tent. They didn't touch much, just brushed enough dirt away to see the name. Even through the plastic, I knew it. The leather was the same honey-brown cover I'd seen on their kitchen table, the one Elena never went anywhere without. It had a faint indentation on the spine from years of being opened at the same angle. Inside the cover, through the smudged film, I could make out her neat handwriting, block letters, careful and clear. Property of Elena Martinez. Nature Journal. I stared at that handwriting longer than I should have, until Ranger Alvarez asked gently if I wanted to see the copies. The pages had already been photographed and transcribed for preservation. They laid the printouts across the table, about 40 pages in total. The early ones were exactly what you'd expect from Elena's sketches of wildflowers, notes about rainfall and temperature, a detailed drawing of vernal fall with small arrows pointing to where the mist formed rainbows at certain hours of the morning. But as the pages went on, the tone changed. The entries grew shorter, sharper. There were mentions of 2 men near their campsite carrying large packs moving toward restricted ground. Not normal hikers, she'd written. Wrong gear. Avoided eye contact. Then an entry that stopped me cold. They saw us watching. I could almost hear her voice in those words, steady but cautious. The way she used to talk when she'd found a rattlesnake sunning near a trail. She'd learned early how to measure risk without panic. But on the last pages that control started to unravel. The handwriting slanted the lines uneven. She described being followed, how the men appeared again near the overlook. One had a scar on his cheek, the other heavy boots with a military tread. The words tightened near the end. They said we saw too much. The final entry ended mid-sentence, the ink smudged as if she'd written in haste. When I looked up, Carlos and Isabel were standing in the doorway. I hadn't even heard them arrive. Isabel's hands were clasped knuckles white. Carlos's ranger badge caught the light, dull and worn, same as him. Ranger Alvarez stepped aside to give them space, but neither moved closer to the table. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Isabel asked, barely audible, "Is it really hers?" I nodded. "It's hers." She let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob, more a breath escaping after too many years held in. Carlos kept his eyes on the papers. When he finally spoke, it was a whisper. "Where did you say they found it?" The next morning, a joint team of Rangers, FBI agents, and forensic techs assembled for an approach into Tenaya Canyon. The area wasn't easy: country, narrow gullies, unstable slopes, sections where the granite seemed to fall away into nothing. That canyon swallows sound and light both. I went in with the first team, leading through a stretch of scree where the journal had been uncovered. The air smelled of wet stone and pine sap. We marked the coordinates, spread out, and began the slow process of sifting through years of debris, fallen branches, shattered rock, compacted soil. Every few feet we found traces of human presence: an old tarp, a corroded fuel can, pieces of nylon that might have been from a tent. It was clear this place had been used before, maybe by people who didn't want to be found. When the FBI techs arrived, they brought high-resolution imaging drones to map the area. One of them pointed out flattened sections near the canyon wall, indents consistent with tents or sleeping bags. The ground told a story even when words couldn't. I could almost see it unfold, the girls scared but trying to stay calm, strangers watching from the trees, a camp that didn't belong here. The team collected everything they could, bagged and tagged even soil samples. Then, near midday, one agent called out that he'd found something metal half buried near a boulder. It was the remains of a small cooking pot, dented on one side. Etched faintly into the soot on the bottom was a single letter, E. Carlos crouched beside it, his hand hovering but not touching. "She used to label her gear," he murmured, "so nothing got mixed up." By the time we returned to base, the canyon light had shifted to that strange blue that comes before dusk. The FBI had already begun tracing names that matched Elena's descriptions. Two stood out: Marcus Reeves and Raymond Torres, both convicted 3 years earlier on federal trafficking charges. Their mugshots might as well have been sketches from Elena's journal. Reeves with the deep facial scar, Torres with a military background and a fondness for tactical gear. The agents believed they'd been using the park as a handoff point for shipments running between Nevada and the coast. It was the kind of thing that happens more often than people realize: criminal networks exploiting the vastness of national land, counting on remoteness to hide their movements. When the news reached Carlos and Isabel, they didn't react the way I expected. There was no outburst, no tears, just stillness. Isabel traced a fingertip along the edge of a photograph. "So, they weren't lost," she said softly. "They were taken." Carlos turned to the window. "They were protecting us," he said. "That's what the journal said, right? They didn't tell us because they didn't want us worried." His voice cracked then, just once. In the days that followed, the investigation moved fast. The FBI arranged interviews with both Reeves and Torres in separate federal facilities. I wasn't part of those interrogations, but I got the summaries. Reeves denied everything. At first said he'd never set foot in Yosemite. But when they showed him copies of the journal pages, descriptions too precise to ignore, his composure slipped. He stopped short at the line where Elena described the scarred man in the boots. After that, his story changed. They weren't supposed to be there, he told them. We didn't plan it that way. Torres, on the other hand, talked. He described the operation, how they used remote canyons to stash shipments before moving them out at night. He said the girls had stumbled onto their drop point. They tried to play it off like curiosity, but Reeves panicked, convinced they'd report them. Torres claimed they only meant to scare them, keep them quiet until the job was done. Then things went wrong. According to him, Sophia tried to run, slipped on a rock shelf, and fell. The drop wasn't far, maybe 20 feet, but enough. Reeves lost control after that. Elena fought back. Torres said it happened fast. His voice broke when he said her name. She was trying to protect her sister, he told the agents. I didn't know what to do. I just wanted it to stop. I wish I could say those words brought relief, but they didn't. They brought finality, which is something different. When I visited the canyon again with the recovery team, the air felt heavier, like the place itself remembered. We found remains beneath the same layer of rock where the journal had been discovered. The forensic techs moved carefully, documenting every inch. 2 sets of human bones, partial but conclusive. Nearby lay pieces of torn fabric, hiking clothes, fragments of gear. There was no mistaking what we'd found. I stood back watching as the evidence markers went down one by one, yellow squares against the gray stone. Carlos and Isabel were notified before sunset. They'd been told to expect this possibility, but expectation doesn't dull the blow. Later, back at the ranger station, I sat with Carlos while the FBI finalized their statements. He asked to see the journal again. When I handed it to him, he held it like something sacred. His thumb brushed the edge of the cover, tracing the faint scratch where she'd once carved her initials. She didn't run, he said quietly. She wrote it down. She made sure someone would know. Isabel joined us a few minutes later, her face pale but calm. She set her hand over his. She wanted us to find her voice, she said. And we did. That night I walked out behind the station to where the valley opened up under a blanket of stars. The waterfall was a distant hum, softer now in the cool air. I thought about how the truth had waited buried beneath years of storms and silence until the right pair of hands uncovered it. I thought about how Elena, in those final moments, had chosen to write to bear witness, even when she must have known no one might ever read it. There's a strength in that I still can't fully explain. The next morning, as the sun crept over the ridge, the investigation shifted again. The agents were cross-referencing Torres's statement with evidence from the canyon. There were indications that Reeves and Torres hadn't worked alone, that there might have been others using the park for the same routes. The thought sent a chill through me. The mountains that had hidden those girls for so long might still be hiding more. As the briefing broke up, Carlos caught my arm. His voice was steady, but his eyes told a different story. Pat, he said, whatever they find next, promise me we'll be there. I told him yes, because after 7 years of silence, we finally had the truth's first whisper, and the mountain wasn't done speaking yet. The morning they confirmed the match, Yosemite felt quieter than I'd ever heard it. Even the birds seemed to know something had shifted. I stood outside the temporary command tent, watching the sun crawl over the granite walls, the light slow and careful, like it was afraid to disturb the air. Inside, the FBI team was finalizing the forensic report. I didn't need to hear the words, they were already written on every face that came out of that tent. It was them. The remains found in the canyon were Elena and Sophia. When they told Carlos and Isabel, we sat together in a small briefing room near the ranger station. The walls were plain white, the kind used for press meetings or storm updates. But that morning, it might as well have been a chapel. The agent read from her notes in that steady professional tone they train for, but her eyes betrayed her. Isabel reached across the table and gripped Carlos's hand, her thumb resting on his wrist as if checking for a pulse. I kept my own hands folded, not trusting what they might do if I didn't. When the agent said the words positive identification, Isabel made a soft sound. Not a cry, exactly, more like the kind of breath that comes after you've held it too long. Carlos didn't move. He just stared at the photo they'd placed on the table, a picture of the canyon taken from above, bright yellow evidence markers dotting the rock like wildflowers that shouldn't have grown there. Later that day, I drove out with the recovery team. The canyon was steep, narrow, a place you'd never find unless you were looking for trouble or trying to disappear. The wind carried a damp chill, the kind that cuts through even in sunlight. Every step echoed, and every echo felt like it came from somewhere you couldn't see. The techs worked in pairs, carefully bagging soil samples and fragments of fabric. I stayed back with the lead agent watching. At one point, she bent down and brushed away a bit of dirt from a small flat object. It was a camera lens cracked clean through. For a moment, we both just looked at it. "She was still taking pictures," I said quietly. The agent nodded but didn't answer. Some things don't need words. The investigation moved fast after that. The evidence from the canyon, the journal, the confessions, all of it lined up too perfectly to ignore. Marcus Reeves and Raymond Torres were already serving time on unrelated trafficking charges, which meant they were easy to reach. The FBI arranged to interview each of them separately. I wasn't in the room, but I got the reports. Reeves held out the longest. He denied being there, denied knowing the sisters, denied even visiting the park. But when they laid out the journal pages in front of him, the sketches, the notes about his scar, the boots, the threats, something in him cracked. He read the last page twice, then said, "I told him not to. That's all." 4 words, but they opened the door. Torres was different. Younger, maybe more human, if that's the word. He didn't fight as hard. He talked for hours, tracing out a story that made the room go silent. He said the girls had seen something they weren't supposed to, one of their drop sites hidden near the trailhead. They followed them out of panic, not planning. When the sisters reached the overlook, things got tense. Torres said Sophia tried to run, slipped on the rock, hit her head. He said Elena screamed and went after her, that Reeves grabbed her to stop her from running. The details after that blur together. Violence, fear, decisions made too fast to take back. Torres kept saying, it wasn't supposed to happen like that. He told them they buried what they could, hid the rest, left the journal behind when the weather turned. I'd seen my share of cruelty over the years. Accidents, crimes, the kind of things nature does when people stop respecting her, but hearing those transcripts even secondhand felt different. These girls weren't reckless. They were smart, prepared, cautious. They'd grown up around rangers, for God's sake. They followed every rule except the one no one ever told them, that the real danger isn't always the cliff or the current. It's people. When the charges were announced, the courtroom filled with faces from every corner of the valley. Rangers, teachers, neighbors, even kids who'd once joined Sophia on junior hikes. Reeves and Torres pleaded guilty to kidnapping and murder in exchange for life sentences. The plea spared Carlos and Isabel a trial, but it didn't spare them the reality of what had been done. I sat behind them during the hearing, watching the back of Carlos's neck tighten each time the prosecutor read another line from the journal. Isabel clutched a small pendant, a pressed daisy inside glass, Elena's favorite flower. When the judge handed down the sentence, the room stayed completely silent. No one clapped, no one gasped. The sound that followed was the shuffle of chains as the deputies led the men away. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Isabel said something I'll never forget. She looked up at the sky, pale blue, no clouds, and said, "They were brave. They saw something wrong and refused to look away. That's what killed them." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were tired, the way they get when grief stops being sharp and becomes part of who you are. In the months that followed, change came in small, practical steps. The Park Service updated its safety protocols, adding training for rangers to recognize signs of criminal activity on federal land. New communication towers went up, patching the blind spots where signals used to die. Carlos helped write part of the training manual himself. He went back into the field not because he wanted to, but because it was the only way he knew to honor them. When he spoke to new recruits, he didn't tell them about the case directly. He just said, "The wilderness isn't empty. It holds everything we put into it, good and bad. Your job is to know the difference." Isabel found her own path. She started volunteering with families of the missing, guiding them through the maze of agencies and paperwork that follows when someone vanishes. She told me once that bureaucracy is just another kind of wilderness, no clear trails, no guarantees. The work gave her purpose. She spoke at conferences, sat on panels, even helped push legislation for better tracking of crimes in national parks. Every time I saw her speak, she carried herself with quiet authority, not anger, the kind of calm that makes people listen. One spring evening, almost a year after the sentencing, she invited me and Nora to a small ceremony near Vernal Fall. A plaque had been placed at a safe overlook, a simple bronze square with their names, dates, and a single line. They loved these mountains and died defending the truth. There were maybe 30 of us there. The wind carried the sound of the waterfall up the gorge, that endless low rumble that never quite stops. When Isabel spoke, she thanked everyone who'd searched, who'd stayed, who hadn't let the girls' names fade. Then she said, "These places, these trails belong to all of us. But we have to keep watch because beauty doesn't erase danger. It just hides it better." Carlos stood beside her, quiet, a folded ranger hat in his hands. When it was over, he placed that hat at the base of the plaque and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then he turned, saw me watching, and gave a small nod. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Driving back that night, the valley looked the same as it always had. Dark pines against starlight, the ribbon of river glinting in the distance, but it didn't feel the same. It hadn't for a long time. The place carried their absence like a shadow, permanent but gentle, the kind you only notice when the light shifts. A few weeks later, Carlos called me from the station. He sounded tired, but there was a spark I hadn't heard in years. "Pat," he said, "they're starting a foundation in the girls' names. Safety programs, scholarships for search and rescue training, that kind of thing. You think you'd help with the logistics?" I told him I would. It felt right turning loss into something that might save someone else down the line. Over the next few years, that foundation grew part of a bigger movement to strengthen wilderness safety and communication across the country. Their work led to new equipment, better radios, improved cooperation between park services and federal agencies. Every time a rescue succeeded because a signal reached when it wouldn't have. Before I thought of those two sisters and the journal that refused to stay buried. Still, there were nights when the old questions crept back. About how close we'd been to finding them sooner, about what signs we'd missed. I'd drive up past Millerton, pull over where the road opens to a view of the Sierra, and just sit with it. The mountains look peaceful from that distance, blue-gray ridges stacked like folded blankets. But I know better now. They hold their secrets deep, and sometimes it takes years for the truth to rise through the stone. The last time I saw Carlos and Isabel together was at a ranger symposium in Sacramento. He was leading a panel on field awareness. She was speaking about advocacy. During a break, we stood in the hallway, paper cups of coffee in our hands, talking about the latest search protocols. Before they left, Isabel looked at me and said, "You ever think they're still out there in a way?" I nodded. Every time I hear the waterfall. That night, as I drove home along the dark stretch of 99, I thought about the journal, the one that began as a record of sunlight and wildflowers, and ended as a map to the truth. It had done what none of us could. It spoke for them when they couldn't. But part of me knew the story wasn't finished. Evidence still turned up now and then, pieces of gear, bits of metal, a footprint in a place no one had reason to walk. Each discovery felt like the land exhaling one last secret. And I remember thinking as the road unwound through the valley and the air cooled with the scent of rain that the wilderness had given back almost everything it took. Almost. What it hadn't returned was the quiet question that lingered at the edge of every new season. What else was buried out there waiting for the right storm, the right pair of eyes, the right moment to be found? Time has a strange way of softening edges without erasing them. The trial, the sentencing, the foundation. All of it moved forward like clockwork, each step necessary and inevitable. But grief doesn't follow the same rhythm. It lingers in odd corners of the day, in the smell of rain on granite, in the echo of a radio channel gone quiet in the empty space at a table that used to feel full. I saw that most in Carlos and Isabel. They didn't collapse under the weight of it. They carried it differently. Isabel once told me that losing her girls felt less like falling and more like learning to walk with half your balance gone. You never stop moving, but every step reminds you of what's missing. The first spring after the canyon recovery, the park bloomed early. Snowmelt rushed down the gullies, washing away the last traces of winter. I drove up to Yosemite to help install new safety markers, small brass plates along high-traffic trails, each one stamped with GPS coordinates for faster rescues. It was part of the new system the Foundation funded, what everyone called the Martinez Initiative. I thought of Elena and Sophia with every plate I drilled in, wondering if their final hours might have gone differently if those coordinates had existed then. The sound of the drill echoed off the rock face, sharp and rhythmic. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like progress. Carlos oversaw much of the project himself. He was quieter now, his humor dulled, but he was still sharp. We worked together in companionable silence, the kind that belongs to people who've run out of things to say but not out of things to do. I remember one afternoon we stopped by the overlook where the plaque stood. The bronze had started to tarnish streaked green from the weather, but their names were still clear. He wiped it with a handkerchief and stood there for a while. "I used to think they belonged to the mountain," he said softly. "Now I think the mountain belongs to them." I didn't answer. Some truths don't need agreement, they just need to be heard. Isabel found a different way to heal. She poured herself into advocacy, lobbying for reforms in how missing persons cases are handled in national parks. She spoke in congressional hearings, her voice calm and deliberate, always choosing her words like they mattered. She never raised her voice once, and somehow that made people listen harder. When the National Search Network Act passed, she sent me a handwritten note that said simply, "This won't bring them back, but it might save someone else's child." That's enough for me. I keep that note tucked in the same field manual I've carried since I was 25. It reminds me that real change often begins with heartbreak. As for me, I stayed with the service until retirement snuck up on me. I'd meant to step away a few years earlier, but the work felt unfinished. When I finally turned in my badge, the station threw one of those potluck send-offs, paper plates, store-bought cake, too many hugs from people you'll only see once or twice again. They gave me a framed photograph of Vernal Fall taken at sunrise. The mist caught the light in a way that made it look alive, like it was breathing. I hung it in my den, but most mornings I still go out to the porch instead. There's something about real air that no picture can hold. Every so often, new hikers still ask about the Martinez sisters. Their story became part of park lore passed along by guides and campfire hosts, softened in retelling but never forgotten. I've overheard versions that sound almost mythical, two brave girls who vanished defending the land spirits watching over the trail. I never correct anyone. Let them believe what they need to. The truth is enough for me. Two sisters went hiking with their parents on a bright October morning. They saw something wrong and they did what good people do. They tried to make it right. And because of that, the wilderness that once took them now protects others in their name. Years later, I visited their foundation office in Fresno. It was modest 3 rooms, a wall of framed photographs, and a big corkboard covered with notes from families who'd been helped by their work. In the corner behind the glass sat a display case. Inside was the journal. The same honey-brown leather cover, the same careful handwriting on the first page. The park had returned it to the family after the case closed. Isabel had donated it to the foundation, saying it belonged to everyone who ever searched for someone they loved. I stood there longer than I meant to, reading a few lines through the glass. The ink had faded in spots, but her voice was still there, steady, curious, full of life. It wasn't a record of fear. It was a record of someone who believed the world was worth understanding even when it turned cruel. Before I left that day, I found Carlos in the back room sorting through gear donations. He'd aged since the last time I'd seen him, but his eyes still carried that ranger calm. We talked about nothing in particular, the weather, the road closures, how the Foundation's youth program was bringing in more volunteers than they could train. When I asked him how he managed to keep doing it, he shrugged. "You keep walking," he said. "That's all there is." Then he smiled a small, tired smile and added, "Besides, they're still with me out there. Every time I hear wind through pines, I know." That night driving home along Highway 41, the valley opened wide below me. Lights scattered like embers. Somewhere beyond those hills the trail wound through the forest and the waterfall kept falling just as it always had. Time doesn't stop for tragedy. It just folds it into the landscape until it becomes part of the story the land tells about itself. I thought of all the searches I'd led, all the names I'd written in logbooks, all the times I'd watched families wait for news that never came. Most of those stories ended quietly, swallowed by the same vastness that makes the mountains beautiful. But not this one. This one left a voice behind. I still keep a copy of the Martinez case file in my personal drawer, though I rarely open it. Not because I've forgotten, but because I don't need the paper to remember. Sometimes when the weather turns cool and the fog settles low, I can almost hear the sound of pages turning in the wind, the faint scrape of pen on paper, the hush of something being written down so it won't vanish. Maybe that's just my mind filling the quiet, but I like to think it's Elena's way of reminding us that truth, once written, never really disappears. These days, people ask if I believe in closure. I tell them I don't think it exists, at least not the way folks imagine it. What you get instead is endurance, the ability to keep living alongside the unanswered parts. You learn to make peace with the fact that some goodbyes don't end. They just grow quieter. The Martinez family taught me that. Their daughters gave them an ending, but not a simple one. It was the kind that asks something of everyone who hears it, to notice more, to protect what's fragile, to never assume the wilderness is empty. When I drive past the trailhead now, I sometimes pull over and step out just to listen. The waterfall sounds the same, but it feels different. Maybe it's because I know what lies behind that beauty, the courage, the loss, the voices that refused to be buried. There's a small bronze plaque near the overlook where visitors leave flowers and folded notes. Most are from strangers who never met the girls but felt the story anyway. I read one once that said, "You reminded us that silence doesn't mean peace." I think that's the truest thing I've ever read. I'm not sure what justice looks like after so much time. The men who did this will die in prison. But that's not the kind of balance that brings comfort. The real justice, I think, is that their secret didn't stay hidden. The mountain gave the truth back piece by piece until someone was ready to listen. And we did. Sometimes when the sun sets over the ridge and the light turns that deep copper color the valley is known for, I'll think of those two girls walking ahead on the trail, their laughter caught somewhere between the trees and the wind. And I like to believe that every hiker who steps onto that path now walks a little safer because of them. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.